Okay, so looks like we are live. So we are engaging in a little bit of debate practice. This is what I call a debate scrimmage. Essentially, what happens is an audience comes up for some subject to debate, one that I do not hold. They give it to me and another party, and then we have to debate that subject regardless of whether we agree on the policy or not. So it's sort of like a way of strengthening our ability to take punches, bring up evidence, and react to controversial evidence on your feet without necessarily getting involved in our own opinions. So I'm sort of acting as a senior party, the person who has a little bit more experience with debate. Fritz is at this stage acting like the junior party, the person who's so essentially the resolution I was given that I'm going to argue here is: have welfare policies benefited the African American community? All right, so Fritz, you want to say hello?
Hi, I'm Fritz. I need help with debating. Hopefully this can start serving as some experience.
Well, yeah, I don't think we have an audience. This should be going private, but people can share it if they want. Oh, people will see it. If this were not private, there'd be like 20 viewers at least. Okay, so all right, so I guess now I'll start laying out the case to why welfare helped the African American community, and really the case I think is not really whether the African American community is doing great. It's really whether welfare or welfare policies hold back the worst of the racism and disadvantages the African American community already faces. I think right off the bat, I think the entire idea of talking about welfare already kind of exhibits a bias because white people had welfare for hundreds of years. Before this, there were always dole systems. There were always social programs meant to elevate white people, and blacks were systematically excluded from these endeavors. So what really the only time welfare even became controversial was in the 60s, when it largely became a way of shoring up the black community in the wake of race riots that essentially of most African American community and a substance abuse epidemic that further destroyed the African American community. And since then, I think welfare has largely been a bogeyman that we've essentially superimposed over our own inability and disinclination to integrate the African American community. So we tried essentially to scale back welfare in the 90s. We saw essentially very little benefit to the African American community. A lot of people like Charles Murray pointed to welfare and losing ground as the reason why the African American community had problems with childlessness, incarceration. We actually scaled it back. We saw essentially no decrease in any of these behaviors. There was essentially, this was a lot of the maleffects were sort of masked by the fact that we were in an economic boom. But other than that, none of the predicted benefits really came from welfare reform. The only things that usually held up were the fact that we were able to execute welfare reform and it wasn't an unmitigated disaster. But other than that, really what we have is we have a welfare system that's holding up an African American community that would, in other words, not be able to support itself any other way. This community is unemployable. In a lot of regards, it cannot sustain for itself. And so the option really isn't, oh, let's make all black people into middle-class Cosby families. The thing is, okay, we have these black families that cannot support themselves. Actually let them starve, let them actually slide further into pathology, or do we use welfare to help them out?
I think the first problem there, on your last point, is that you're treating the entire black community as this one single monolithic group of people.
The resolution does that. The resolution does that. There's no way that we can argue this resolution, either positive or negative, without grouping the African American community into a big block. If you argue against it, the African American community is not in big block. I mean, I assume that the block we're talking about is African Americans on welfare.
Sure, that makes more sense. So the existence of...
So that we can identify that demographic then, right?
So the existence, though, of African Americans that are not on welfare is proof then that African Americans do not need to be on welfare.
How is that?
Well, the very existence. They're not on welfare. Why aren't they on welfare? And why is a large section
wouldn't that be sort of like saying that the existence of people who aren't sick is evidence that we don't need health care or health insurance?
Well, I think the problem is the idea that health care and health insurance actually tries to help, actually is shown to, make sick people well. And the argument is that welfare doesn't actually make poor people rich.
Not really. I mean, there are chronic conditions that people come down with. It's not really a matter of fixing the disease. It's just a matter of not letting people die in pain. For instance, like I have a back condition that requires periodic physical. Guys, look, I asked you to mute yourself for a reason, right? Someone come in. Oh, sorry. Was that? Oh, that was you. Pardon me. I thought that was Mauritian. I'm sorry. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump on you. So it didn't sound like you there for a moment. So for instance, I have a periodic chronic condition. It requires healthcare. So in a lot of ways, I'm taking money out of the healthcare system, even though it's not governmental assistance. But still, it's not making me better. All it is making it so that I'm not constantly in pain.
So you don't think that poverty is a condition that can actually be treated, that there's a way for people to get out of poverty?
I think there's a way to get people get out of poverty, but I don't think that's really the question. The question is, are we going to let people suffer in poverty, or are we actually going to make the best of a bad situation, essentially, right? I think a lot of this stuff with welfare, it's a sort of vindictive vengeance upon the poor, right? Like we're really angry at them for being poor, so we want to make being poor really, really uncomfortable for them, when there's really no evidence, in my opinion, that making people uncomfortable in poverty does anything other than, inflict some kind of cathartic justice that we have. Well, we have a sense that we need to actually punish people for being down and out.
The problem is that during the Industrial Revolution, there wasn't a welfare state. There was virtually zero government benefit to the poor. Yet, after 100 years of industrialization, from the early 19th century to the early 20th century, you had the emergence of a very large growing middle class, virtually without the existence of welfare payments. How did that happen?
Well, largely due to the fact that we don't live in a 19th century economy. Like if you were a poor African American in a 19th century economy, you'd be essentially off the grid, working very, very low income jobs that we fundamentally don't have anymore. These jobs that people would hire African American more, these people, sharecropping jobs were largely exploitative and don't exist anymore. But if you were to go to the 19th century for African Americans, that would be a huge employer of them. Now, the situation is totally different. You've got a community living in an urban environment with no jobs available in their skill range. And the question is not whether we can go back to the 19th century. The question is, how are you going to handle this population?
The point is this. So the fact that they don't have skills and that there's not jobs they can get with the skills they have, what about the idea that what about instead of spending money to keep them where they are so that they don't get worse, do you think that money might be better well spent on helping educate them and getting the skills, or helping to get jobs so they can support themselves?
Yeah, I would hear this argument like, welfare is making this major inroad in our budget, but it's really not. I mean, the welfare is within the rounding error of half of the large programs that go out to a general consumer. Of all the social programs, the only ones that even make a significant dent are the Social Security and the Medicaid. The welfare is around 1%.
Well, regardless of whether or not
it's like within the rounding errors of our military spending. So if we're talking about how we rearrange our budgets to make more money for people to get educated, just take that from the military spending.
Well, regardless of whether or not of how much of an impact it makes on the budget, the actual argument stands that, do you think that the money used to dole out welfare payments we better spent on trying to educate the Black community?
I reject the notion that it's mutually exclusive. I mean, the only way it could be mutually exclusive is if we were running out of money. Is this 0.05% of the national budget? Like, I mean, we spend more on on our Joint Strike Fighters than we do on welfare programs for the African American community. So it's a minuscule portion of the population, food stamps and the like.
Mm-hmm. The thing is, if it's demonstrable that the welfare payments have actually had no demonstrable benefit to the Black community, regardless of...
I don't think you demonstrated that.
All right. Well, I think that... Well, currently, the trends show that both in the African-American community and the wider community, the rates of single motherhood have increased.
Sure.
That the unemployment rate among the Black community is... The unemployment rate among the Black community is substantially higher than it would have been 50, 60 years ago before the welfare payments started. That the Black community, in 1929, the unemployment rate among African Americans was lower than it would have been among whites. The rate of fatherlessness would have been lower. And after 50 years of welfare, that has reversed. And now they have one of the highest rates of single motherhood and the highest rates of, substantially higher rates of crime.
But are you saying that's due to welfare? I find that really hard to believe.
Well, I find it hard to believe that, something else caused it, because we got rid of the legal restriction, the racially.
I find it easy to believe that something else caused it.
All right, could you identify what caused this?
Oh yeah, I mean, you could a variety of things could have caused it. Changing cultural mores that essentially created the incentive to break up the families. A large amount of it was the fact that low-skilled jobs just left the cities in this time period.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's
increase in substance abuse, right? Most people don't realize this. They talk a lot about opioid abuse going on in the white community right now. You hear that all the time: opioid abuse, opioid abuse, opioid abuse. Mm-hmm. There was a huge substance abuse in the African American community in the late '60s and early '70s, and you never heard about this because it occurred in we don't usually care about issues that occur in communities of color.
Really?
Yeah, really, we don't.
Then why?
I think those are much more likely the factors for these problems you're saying, and so now the thing is, it's like, well, we want to go back in time.
Well,
okay, but taking away food from poor people is not a time machine.
I never said that.
Well, okay. You've identified a pathology that's occurred over time, but you haven't. I haven't heard yet any evidence to link it directly to.
Well, the argument used against this is that because the reason why unemployment rate is substantial, why the single motherhood rate is substantially higher among the within the Black community than it would be among the white community, and even less among the Asian community, is that because of welfare payments. Now, I will actually agree with you that changing social mores, and I would add increasing laws legalizing no-fault divorce, have increased the separation of the family. That because that you have such an increased rate of single mothers, they need an extra source of income to support their families. Now, if there is a welfare state, if they're guaranteed to get more welfare payments, then that sort of acts as a surrogate father or as a surrogate second income that they normally would have gotten before the welfare payments began. And the argument is that because there's a continued that this starts causing a cycle of poverty, that starts a cycle to get them dependent on this, because it means that say I'm a black single mother. I need money. The government's giving me money. I need as a supplementary income for my family. Now,
by the way, we should make it clear that many people get supplementary incomes from the government, not just Black single mothers, right? An enormous number of old white people and middle class white people get supplementary income from the government. Social Security is a big piece of supplementary income.
But you will agree that the rate of single motherhood is much higher in the Black community than it would be in the white community, right?
I mean, the Black community has kind of been the canary in the coal mine in this regard, but the problem really hasn't. I'm not convinced that the trend can't happen in the white community. This is
it is happening in the white community.
Okay, well, there you go, right?
Yes, but the thing is, I fail to see how the welfare payments have actually helped the Black community. Because the thing is, your statement is
prevented misery.
prevented misery, that's not saying it helped them, because the fact is, if you
I don't know. I mean, like, if they're starving, are they going to be? If you have malnourished kids, is that going to be instrumental to your plans of re-educating these people?
The problem is you actually have the opposite now with even higher obesity rates among the Black community, because the food that they can afford with the welfare payments is the only food they can afford is much less healthy. But I understand the idea.
That's neither here nor there, right? Like, you know, the fact that they've got food stamps to pay for food to begin with. I mean, you could argue that, you know, they make poor choices, but that's different than whether we actually give them the ability to buy food to begin with. I mean, okay, there's many problems with obesity and poor food choices in this country, and a lot of people of color live in what are called food deserts, where we don't allow them to get the nutritional needs they need to get.
Don't allow them.
We don't give them access to good food.
And who's this we?
We are the society that designs neighborhoods.
Okay, so this is a problem.
But anyway, the larger. I need to answer your question here. The larger point is that that their decisions to their access to good food is immaterial. The question is, will they have the ability to buy food or not? And obesity is a big problem, but malnutrition, starvation.
You think
that's a lot worse.
You think if we were to take away the welfare payments, there'd be mass starvation in the Black community immediately?
It could happen.
Could happen. So now, what would you say to the idea of actually trying to implement policies that try and gradually get the Black community off of welfare? Because the thing is, it's not an ideal situation already. Because you think this population wants to be dependent on government handouts.
Yeah, no, it's not an ideal situation, of course. But I don't think that's really the question. I mean, sure, we need more money into education and to outreach into urban renewal to get people the jobs they need.
The problem is, I think this problem is even deeper with education, because Black communities on average receive, inner city urban areas tend to have receive more money per school, spend more money per student than on suburban white communities. Yet the graduation rates, the test scores are substantially lower in these communities.
Oh, that's a problem, and a lot of it has to do with just the fact of how we invest in students. There are a lot of sort of sneaky ways that we give white students an advantage, and Black students don't have an advantage.
Explain.
Well, I think it's a little bit off topic, don't you think?
Suppose, yes, sure, but welfare. Okay,
we're talking about educational inequality. I mean, I'm in total agreement that we need more money into urban education.
Well, I actually said it doesn't even seem to be a problem of more money, because they already get a proportionally more amount of money than white students, and they still have lower test scores. I think this is a much deeper problem than that, and I think that making these people.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's a deep problem.
I mean, you said it yourself. This population is currently unemployable because they don't have skills. That's why they need welfare. Because if the government
it's because we don't have low-skill jobs to give them.
And why don't we have low-skill jobs to give them?
Because the economy fundamentally changed in the 60s and 70s.
Okay, so either we move to a situation where there are these low-skilled jobs, but since we've transitioned to a post-industrial economy, that's probably not going to be the case.
And the question, I think, with welfare is: are we going to punish Black people for the fact that our economy changed? That seems to be the question. Are we going to starve them because we're unhappy that we don't have low-skilled jobs like we did in the 60s?
The problem is that this is assuming the idea that if the government doesn't continuously, bolster these populations, Black or white, whatever, they will starve. That these people are incapable of actually supporting themselves. And I don't think there's evidence for that.
I think that there's a lot of evidence that these populations are in need. I mean, that's all we really need to establish. I mean, if you have some plan to get people out of poverty, by all means, implement it. Mm-hmm. But the idea that welfare is this big block, this strikes me as, I don't know.
The problem is, I don't think I've seen any. I don't think I've seen any market improvement in the standard of living among Blacks in the past 50 years with the welfare state.
Well, that's because of all the disasters I talked about. But the question is, are we going to make all of those societal problems the problem of, are we going to essentially punish poor Black people for the pathologies we've developed in the society over the last 50 years?
The problem is these Black people are part of this greater society. There isn't just an us and them. We aren't this evil blob of white people trying to, go, how are we
I didn't say we were.
Many of the people that are making decisions are already Black themselves.
Well, that's the case. But if you're an upper middle class person and you do drugs and you get someone pregnant, what's the likely outcome going to be? They're going to get an abortion. If you get arrested for doing drugs, you're going to get a light sentence, and then you're going to go to college and you get a good job in a high skilled employment. If that happened to a young African American man, hold on. If that happened to a young African American man, that's like game over on life, right? They're much less likely to seek abortions for a pregnancy. They're much more likely to have unplanned pregnancies result in children, which will prevent them from getting further skills, and they're much more likely to get sentenced to jails for very long terms. So it's not really fair to say, oh, well, the white community with all these advantages has solved these problems. It's sort of disingenuous to imply that. It's sort of speaking from a perspective of privilege, which is what I think this conversation is really about. This conversation it's really blaming Black people for not being privileged, right? Which I don't think that it's fair to punish people for not having privileges. And I think that's what the real problem is in our society.
This isn't a conversation about privilege, though. It's just about. I mean, if you want to make it a conversation about privilege,
I demonstrated in what I mean. I'm just showing how privilege is operating in this specific conversation.
The problem is that I think that by your own logic, the fact is, so do you think that upper middle class white people that are making these policies actually know what would benefit the Black community?
I don't know, but I mean, these policies have the support of the African American community, so I'm not so sure.
I mean, why wouldn't they? If people are giving you free money, and all you have to do is not make above a certain amount.
Okay, so is your case that the African American community is not in favor of welfare, or that it is? I think it is, right? It's safe to say.
Well, why do you think they're in favor of welfare? Because do you think just because
I think they're in favor of it for very much the same reasons that I listed in this conversation.
Mm-hmm. The thing is,
which is
in favor of it, but do you think it's actually benefiting them? I don't think it is.
Well, yeah, that's what we're debating, and I think it does benefit them, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm arguing in favor of the fact that it benefits them.
Problem is that currently with the way welfare payment works is that, all right, I receive a check from the government for this amount every month. So long as I'm not making above this amount of money.
Yes.
Do you not think that lowers the incentive for them to make more than that?
Most people on welfare don't want to be on welfare.
Okay, then why are they on welfare? Because they can't. Otherwise, they don't.
Yeah, so that's exactly why that's why they're on welfare, is because they don't have any other opportunities not to be. They don't have opportunities to get to the next class.
And you do not think that the disincentive to rise above what the being able to receive the welfare benefit is actually hindering this? And you don't think that?
I think most people, if they had the option of joining the middle class, they would.
Well, obviously, it's not a situation of just I choose to be in the middle class. It's you actually have to work. The thing is, you have to work towards that. And I actually think
I think it's whether there's institutions that help them enter the middle class. I don't think that our institutions have helped the African American community.
The problem is that currently the institutions that are dominating the Black community aren't helping them. That single motherhood in the Black community is still the highest among all demographics in the country. That they still have way lower test scores than white and Asian students. That they still have a much higher incarceration rate, unemployment, and drug use, criminal behavior. And despite the fact that for the past 40 years, these institutions that are supposed to be helping them have been dominated by people that would be advocating for the welfare state, and yet these things have gone worse. So
What, things have gotten worse? I mean, I've already explained what the situation of the declining low skill economy.
But do you not think that?
I don't see how that. Well, I think over the course of this conversation, we've really failed to link the fact that these things have gone bad to the conclusion that we need to take money away from poor people, which seems to be where we're going with this, right? Like, bad things happened, therefore let's take food away from poor people.
Well, the problem is that you're saying take money away from poor people. The thing is, where does this money? This money has to come from somewhere, right? This money has to
it does.
Comes from what?
Well, I mean, it comes from the government. Like, a lot of money you've gotten by using the public schools. Like, a lot of money. But look, you've gotten money from the public schools. You've gotten money from the police department. You've gotten money from a variety of governmental sources. If all you're saying is that these people participate in the government and they participate in benefits from that's not sufficient, because we all take money from the government.
Actually, I have to scratch this. I have to go to the other AMA now.
Okay. Well, I'll see you later then.
All right. We can.
Okay. We'll stop the broadcast. All right.